The early winter mornings in Boston always bring cold winds sweeping through the street corners. Caroline Webb glanced at her watch as she hurried down the dimly lit hospital corridor. 10 minutes until the end of her shift. And 1 hour until school let out. She took a deep breath and checked the chart of her last patient. "Caroline, you've worked hard today," a fellow nurse called out with a smile. Caroline nodded, forcing a smile onto her tired face. As a single mother, her face bore the marks of many hardships. Yet, her warm brown eyes still held a gentle kindness. "Thanks, Jenny. I need to hurry, I have to pick up Thomas." After finishing her shift and changing into her street clothes in the locker room, Caroline quickly left the hospital. As she jogged toward the bus stop, she thought about her son Thomas. A sensitive, gentle 8-year-old boy. He was her everything. When she arrived at the school, children were already streaming out through the gates. Caroline searched for Thomas's small figure among the crowd. He was standing a little distance away, fixing his shoelaces by himself. "Thomas." The boy looked up and, upon seeing his mother, broke into a soft smile. Yet in his eyes, there was always a faint shadow of sadness. "Mom, you're early today."
Do you know some people earn over $10,000 a month just by posting Reddit stories on YouTube? No face, no voice, just a laptop. I do it too, link below if you're curious.
"Yes, I promised, didn't I? Today's the day we make pizza." They boarded the bus and headed to their small apartment. It was a modest 2-bedroom place, but Caroline did her best to create a warm home. Handmade photo frames lined the walls, and here and there were small antique trinkets she had found in thrift shops. "Did you finish your homework?" Caroline asked as she rolled out the pizza dough in the kitchen. "Yes, math was easy. But the family tree assignment is." Thomas's voice trailed off. "Family tree." Caroline paused for a moment. Her family relationships were complicated. Her parents were still alive, but relations were strained. Especially with her sister Vivian, they had grown apart after being constantly compared since childhood. "What's wrong?" she asked gently. Everyone in class was writing about their dads and grandparents. Caroline knelt in front of her son and took his small hands in hers. "Thomas, families come in all shapes and sizes. Ours may be small, but we're still a real family." She showed her best smile, but inside she felt a pang of hurt. Thomas's father had disappeared before he was born, and her parents, especially her mother Martha, had treated her shamefully for being an unwed mother. Meanwhile, her sister Vivian was always treated as the perfect daughter, and had succeeded as a marketing director for a luxury resort. After dinner, while Thomas finished his homework, Caroline checked the mail that had arrived. Bills, advertisements, and an elegant envelope. She immediately knew what it was. An invitation, engraved in gold letters on cream-colored luxury paper. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Vivian Webb and Richard Hamilton." Caroline quietly closed the invitation. Even at family gatherings that happened once every 3 years, her mother and Vivian looked down on her and Thomas. She felt sick just imagining what the wedding would be like. But she reminded herself, for Thomas. To teach him the value of family. She took a bottle of water from the refrigerator, took a sip, and calmed herself. The next day, Caroline used her day off to visit her mother, Martha. The impressive house in suburban Boston was where she had grown up, but now it felt like an alien place. "Caroline, you're not planning to wear that to the wedding, are you?" Martha said at the doorway. No greeting, as if Caroline's very existence was distasteful to her. "Hello, Mother. Thank you for the invitation. Vivian sent that. I thought it unnecessary, but she insisted on inviting all family members. Richard's family is very distinguished, so I pray you and that child won't embarrass us." Caroline took a deep breath. How many times had this conversation repeated itself? "How is Thomas?" Martha seemed hesitant even to speak her grandson's name. "He's fine, Mother. He'd like to see you." "Yes, well, when I have time," Martha said vaguely. She had spent time with Thomas perhaps a handful of times in his 8 years of life. Caroline cut the visit short and held back tears on her way home. Still, she was determined. For her son, and for herself, she would attend this wedding. To properly teach Thomas the meaning of family. She repeated in her mind over and over, family is important. That's something he should understand someday. When she returned to the apartment, Thomas was reading by the window. Caroline sat beside him and quietly put her arm around his shoulders. "Thomas, Aunt Vivian is getting married. We've been invited." The boy nodded silently. He didn't say anything, but Caroline understood. Thomas, too, felt the complexity of this family in his small heart. On the wedding day, Caroline adjusted Thomas's tie and checked their reflection in the mirror. She had spent several months' salary on an elegant navy dress she'd found in a second-hand shop. Thomas, wearing a small suit, looked a bit more grown-up than usual. "You look handsome," Caroline kissed his cheek. "Ready?" Thomas nodded silently. There was anxiety in his eyes. Caroline gently embraced her son's shoulders. "It'll be fine. Today is a special day. We're celebrating Aunt Vivian." As they rode in the taxi to the historic church in suburban Boston, Caroline gazed out the window, lost in thought. She had hesitated many times about attending the ceremony. But she had decided to go for Thomas's sake, to teach him what family means. When they arrived at the church, the parking lot was lined with luxury cars, and the venue was already filled with elegantly dressed people. Caroline took Thomas's hand, took a deep breath, and entered. "Caroline." She turned around to see a paternal aunt she hadn't seen in a long time. "My, how you've grown. Is this Thomas?" She showed superficial politeness, but her eyes were appraising Caroline's dress. When the conversation ended, the aunt returned to her circle of relatives, and their laughter soon reached Caroline's ears. The church was beautifully decorated with flowers and greenery. Caroline and Thomas quietly sat in the back rows. Before the ceremony began, her mother Martha, dressed in an expensive purple gown, stood before Caroline. "I'm glad you came," Martha said in a low voice. "Richard's family is in the front row. Those gentlemen in black suits. The Hamiltons are well-known landowners in this area. His father is a leader in the real estate industry." Caroline nodded, but Martha was already not listening to her. At the front of the venue, the Hamilton family relatives were exchanging greetings gracefully. Richard's mother, wearing an elegant pearl necklace, smiled warmly at each relative. However, when her gaze turned toward Caroline and Thomas, her smile stiffened slightly. The pipe organ sounded, and the ceremony began. Vivian, dressed in a white gown, entered escorted by her father. She was beautiful. Caroline silently wished her sister happiness. She remembered the pure sisterly bond they had shared as children. When had it become so twisted? "Mom, Aunt Vivian looks pretty," Thomas whispered. Caroline smiled gently. "Yes, she's very beautiful." The ceremony was conducted solemnly, and the bride and groom exchanged vows of love. Richard was tall, with handsome features, and his eyes were filled with love as he gazed at Vivian. He seemed like a good young man without question. After the ceremony, the guests moved to a nearby luxury hotel for the reception. The ballroom was decorated lavishly, with a champagne tower gleaming in the center. When Caroline and Thomas gave their names at the reception desk, the attendant looked at them somewhat hesitantly. "Ah, yes. Your seats are this way." They were directed to a spot at the edge of the large ballroom, almost hidden from view. The surrounding seats were empty, keeping them at a distance from other guests. "Mom, we're far from everyone," Thomas whispered anxiously. Caroline maintained her composure. It's all right. I'm sure it's just coincidence. As the reception progressed, the newlyweds made their rounds greeting each table. Caroline, with a glass in hand, watched her sister's happy figure from afar. Vivian came to their table last. Caroline, thank you for coming, Vivian said with a formal smile. Thomas, I'm glad you could come to your aunt's wedding. There was no warmth in her words. Thomas said a small, congratulations, but Vivian's attention was already directed toward the next guest. It's time for a toast, the MC announced. We'd like to invite the bride's sister, Caroline Webb, to give a speech. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Caroline. She stood up, surprised. It was completely unexpected. But for her sister's sake, she smiled and raised her glass. Vivian, Richard, I sincerely congratulate you on your new beginning, Caroline said quietly but firmly. As a sister, I'm happy that my sister has found her ideal partner today. May your life together be filled with love and happiness. It was a brief but sincere speech. But when Caroline returned to her seat, Vivian stood up. Thank you for those lovely words, she said with a glamorous smile. But few people know the true bond between us sisters. Caroline has always been my role model. Although I've taken a different path from her choices, it's because of my sister's presence that I met Richard today. A subtle atmosphere spread through the room. While Vivian's words superficially showed respect for her sister, it was clear she was implicitly criticizing Caroline's life choices. Martha nodded with satisfaction. Caroline maintained her smile while tightly gripping Thomas's small hand under the table. In her son's eyes, though he said nothing, there was a wisdom that understood everything. As the reception approached its latter half, Richard came alone to Caroline's table. Nice to meet you, Caroline, he said in a quiet voice. Hello, Thomas. Congratulations, Caroline replied politely. Richard looked around at their isolated table and frowned slightly. You're a very patient person, he said in a meaningful tone. Then he turned to Thomas and knelt to the boy's eye level. I respect your mother. She's a remarkable woman. With that, Richard stood up and returned to the bride. Caroline watched his back, enveloped in a strange sensation. What did those words mean? Did Richard know about her position within the family? The reception continued, and it was time for dancing. Caroline and Thomas just quietly watched from the corner. No matter how much they tried to pretend to be the ideal family, they were outside that circle. Still, Caroline kept smiling for her son's sake. Thomas, she gently touched his cheek. Are you hungry? I'll get you some cake. She stood up and headed to the cake table. There, she unexpectedly ran into Richard's mother. You're Caroline. The older woman looked at her. Your son is a lovely boy. Caroline looked at her in surprise. Thank you. I heard about you. From Richard. The elderly woman said nothing more and walked away with a smile. As Caroline returned to her seat with cake, she thought about it. At this wedding, they were playing the part of the ideal family on the surface, but complex truths lurked beneath. She smiled at her son. At least the bond between her and Thomas was real. The reception was moving from dinner to dance time. As the lights in the venue dimmed slightly, creating a magical atmosphere, the MC spoke up again. Now, it's time for a special surprise from the bride. Vivian, Richard, please come to the center. Vivian, with a glamorous smile, took Richard's arm and walked into the spotlight. She captured the attention of the entire room and ceremoniously took the microphone. Everyone, thank you so much for coming today. On this special day, we have one more surprise. She turned her gaze toward Caroline and Thomas. Big sister and Thomas, we've prepared a special seat for you. The staff will guide you. Caroline looked confused. They already had seats. Thomas also looked up at his mother anxiously. Vivian's speech continued. Family means everything to me. Today is a special day when that family grows. And I've put special thought into it for my sister and nephew, who are family members. 2 staff members came to Caroline and Thomas. This way, please. They were guided to a spot in the corner of the venue, a bit separated. Caroline was shocked. There was an old table and 2 dirty chairs, clearly different from the other tables. The table's surface was wobbly, and the chairs were unstable. And there was a small sign placed on top. Temporary break area, warning for crying noise. The room buzzed. Caroline stood frozen, at a loss for words. Thomas held his mother's hand tightly, looking around with a confused expression. Please, have a seat, one of the staff said expressionlessly. Caroline took a deep breath and gently placed her hand on Thomas's shoulder. It's okay, she whispered softly. They sat in the designated seats. The table leg wobbled, and the chairs were unstable. Vivian approached with a smile. Behind her were Martha and Richard. Richard's expression showed confusion. What do you think? Vivian said loudly to the other guests. This is my surprise. Our pets. She seemed to stumble over her words for a moment but quickly recovered with a forced smile. I mean, my sister and her child. Uncertain laughter rippled through the venue. Many guests uncomfortably averted their eyes. However, some people laughed without restraint. Martha, in particular, stood near her daughter with a satisfied expression. Vivian. Richard frowned and tried to grab her arm, but Martha intervened. What a lovely sense of humor, Vivian, Martha raised her voice to the surrounding guests. There's love even in a doghouse. At her words, Caroline froze. This was a planned humiliation. She felt heat rising in her cheeks. But when her son's small shoulders began to tremble beside her, something changed within her. Caroline looked under the table. Thomas was trying desperately to hold back tears. His small lips trembled, and tears welled in his eyes. Yet, he didn't utter a single complaint. Mom. He whispered softly. Caroline gripped her son's hand and raised her face with a resolute expression. She was about to stand up when Richard moved first. His face was colored with anger. Enough, he said in a quiet but firm voice. Vivian looked at him in confusion. Richard, this is a joke. On our special day. This is not a joke, Richard interrupted her. He took the microphone and began to address the entire room. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. What you've just witnessed was not planned by me. And I cannot endorse this. The room fell silent. Vivian lost color in her face, and Martha froze. Caroline and Thomas are people who should become my family, Richard continued. And I cannot allow them to be insulted. Caroline, Thomas, please come to my family's table. Richard extended his hand toward the head table where his parents sat. His father stood up and nodded. Vivian, Richard turned to his fiancée. If this was your plan, then you're not the person I thought you were. Vivian stood dumbfounded. Her perfect wedding had crumbled in an instant. Martha was equally at a loss for words. Caroline slowly stood up and took Thomas's hand. Let's go, Thomas, she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but inside she was deeply shaken. The two moved to the head table under Richard's guidance. His parents welcomed them warmly, and Richard's mother sat next to Thomas and smiled kindly. You're a brave boy, she said softly. The atmosphere in the venue remained frozen. Vivian grabbed Richard's arm, desperately whispering something, but he calmly shook her hand off. Martha stood by her daughter, warily looking around. Their perfect plan had completely backfired. Caroline put her arm around her son's shoulders and thanked the Hamilton family for their kindness. As food was served, Thomas began to regain his composure. Mom, is it okay for us to be here? He asked in a small voice. Of course, Caroline answered gently. We haven't done anything wrong. Richard sat right next to them and faced Caroline with a serious expression. Please forgive me. I had no idea this would happen. Caroline nodded. You've done nothing wrong. Rather, thank you. The reception continued in a tense atmosphere. When it was time for dancing, Richard ceremoniously danced with Vivian, but there was obvious tension between them. Afterward, he asked Caroline to dance as well. You don't have to dance with me, Caroline said. No, I'm asking sincerely, Richard's eyes were earnest. When the two stood on the dance floor, the room's attention gathered on them again. Vivian and Martha watched with expressions of anger and humiliation. I'd like to meet with you and Thomas tomorrow, Richard said quietly during the dance. I have something to discuss. Caroline nodded. In her heart, fear and expectation mingled. This wedding had turned out far beyond her expectations. Humiliation and courage, and an unexpected ally. As the reception drew to a close, many guests began to leave early. Caroline and Thomas also said goodbye to Richard's parents and quietly left the venue. In the taxi, Thomas rested his head on his mother's shoulder, looking exhausted. Mom, how was today? He asked in a small voice just before falling asleep. Caroline gently stroked her son's hair and answered, sometimes there are difficult times, but overcoming them makes us stronger. Today, you were very brave. Thomas nodded and quickly fell asleep. The next morning, as Caroline made pancakes for Thomas, she thought about yesterday's events. The humiliating surprise, Richard's unexpected intervention, and his, I want to talk, words. Thomas was quietly drawing at the kitchen table. Recovering from yesterday's events would be difficult even for adults. How much more so for an 8-year-old child? Good morning, Thomas, Caroline smiled as she served the pancakes. What kind of picture are you drawing today? A picture of our new family, Thomas answered with a serious expression. Richard and his mom and dad are in it too. Caroline peered at her son's drawing. It showed her and Thomas, along with Richard and his parents. There were no figures of Vivian or Martha. That's a lovely picture, she said quietly. The doorbell rang, and Caroline checked the clock. 10 a.m. It was time for her appointment with Richard. She opened the door and greeted him politely. Good morning, Richard. He was dressed in casual jeans and a sweater, a stark contrast to yesterday's formal attire. He held a small paper bag in his hand. Caroline, thank you for making time, he said with a serious expression. I brought this for Thomas. Inside the paper bag was an intricately crafted wooden model airplane. Thomas accepted it with shining eyes. Thank you, Richard. You're welcome. Thomas, while you play with that, may I talk with your mom for a bit? Thomas nodded and headed to his room with the model airplane. Caroline invited Richard into the living room and offered him coffee. I'm really sorry about yesterday, Richard apologized first. I think it was completely planned. Caroline nodded quietly. Vivian has always wanted to prove she's better than me since we were children. But yesterday was beyond the pale, Richard continued. Actually, I've decided to postpone my marriage to Vivian. Caroline stared at him in surprise. What? After yesterday, I feel like I saw Vivian's true character, Richard exhaled deeply. In fact, since we started dating, whenever you came up in her conversations, I felt something was off. She always referred to you as Caroline the life failure or my sister with the kid. Caroline stared at her coffee cup. She said that. My parents value family above all else. My mother in particular always felt uncomfortable when Vivian talked about you and Thomas. So yesterday, when they saw that treatment. You were brave, Caroline said quietly. It's not easy to oppose your fiancé in public. I just did what was right, Richard answered sincerely. Caroline, I had heard fragments from Vivian about how hard you've worked. As a single mother, working diligently, raising Thomas, and yet receiving little support from your family. Caroline said nothing. Her silence told the whole story. This morning, Vivian and Martha came to see me at the hotel, Richard continued. They made excuses that yesterday was just a joke and blamed my reaction as excessive. But my parents were also present. Your parents too? Caroline was surprised. Yes. My mother was particularly angry. She said, I don't want someone who insults family to be my son's wife. Caroline was enveloped in complex emotions. She had not received understanding from her own family, but ironically, was being defended by her sister's fiancé and his family. Rumors are spreading around town, Caroline said quietly. This morning, I got a call from a neighbor asking, are you okay? Boston's social circle is small, Richard smiled bitterly. The Hamilton family's eldest son opposing the bride's family at a wedding, it'll make good gossip. As their conversation continued, the doorbell rang violently. When Caroline opened the door, Vivian and Martha stood there. Both wore expressions filled with anger. Caroline. Martha grabbed her daughter's coat. What have you done? What did you say to Richard? Mother, I didn't. Let us in, Vivian forcefully pushed the door open. However, upon seeing Richard in the living room, she paused for a moment. Richard, what are you doing here? Richard stood up and calmly said, I was talking with Caroline. About yesterday. That was just a joke. Vivian's voice rose. It was our wedding. For you to take Caroline's side. A joke? A new voice echoed from the living room door. It was Richard's parents. Young lady, we came in because the front door was open. Would you mind telling us more about your joke? The color drained from Martha's face. The Hamilton family's influence in Boston's social circles far surpassed the Webb family's. Mrs. Hamilton, for such a small misunderstanding. Martha tried to smooth things over. Misunderstanding? Richard's mother said in a stern tone. Making a child cry who was to be my grandchild and insulting his mother in public is a misunderstanding. Mrs. Webb, I'm astonished at your values. Vivian turned back to Richard. Our marriage. I'm postponing it, Vivian, Richard said quietly. At least until I understand the real you. Richard. Vivian cried. You're being manipulated by Caroline. She's always been jealous of my happiness. Vivian, that's enough, Martha grabbed her daughter's arm. She was beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation. If their relationship with the Hamilton family broke, it would affect her social standing as well. Thomas came out of his room and stood quietly beside his mother. He squared his small shoulders and looked at Vivian and Martha. Don't speak badly about my mom, his voice was small but clear. Caroline placed her hand on her son's shoulder. Thomas. Richard's mother faced Thomas with a soft smile. You are a very brave boy. Martha and Vivian were speechless. Their perfect plan had completely backfired, and now they were in a position to pay a social price. Let's go, Vivian, Martha urged her daughter. The two left the house in silence. Afterward, a strange stillness flowed through the living room. Caroline hugged Thomas and expressed words of gratitude to Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton and Richard. You stood up for us. Thank you so much. Family means protecting one another, Richard's mother said kindly. 6 months later, Boston was wrapped in the beautiful attire of early summer. Sunlight streaming through the window of Caroline's apartment cast a warm light in the living room. Thomas, are you ready? Caroline called from the kitchen. Richard will be here to pick you up soon. I'm already ready. Thomas's cheerful voice returned. He came to his mother with a new backpack slung over his shoulder, looking pleased. In these 6 months, many things had changed. Richard and Vivian's engagement was officially dissolved, and Martha's social standing had been shaken. Meanwhile, surprisingly, Richard and the Hamilton family continued their interactions with Caroline and Thomas. Richard doted on Thomas like a nephew, taking him to baseball games and the Science Museum on weekends. The doorbell rang, and Thomas rushed to answer it. Richard. When the door opened, Richard stood there with a warm smile. Hey, champion. Ready for fishing today? Yes. I packed everything myself. Caroline smiled as she saw them off. Richard turned back and gave her a gentle wink. Between them, a quiet but certain friendship had blossomed. It was not a romantic feeling, but a deep bond of mutual respect. As Caroline was cleaning the apartment, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Hamilton. Caroline, have you made plans for Christmas? No, nothing special. We'd love for you to come to our home. Richard's cousins and their families will be gathering too. I think Thomas would enjoy it. Caroline was filled with gratitude. 6 months ago, she had been isolated from her family, but now she was within the circle of a new family. Though not connected by blood, they were bound by a kindness that cared for one another. Thank you, we'd love to come. After hanging up the phone, Caroline gazed out the window. Toward the direction where Martha's mansion would be, on the other side of town. Vivian and Martha were now isolated. The wedding scandal had caused significant ripples in social circles, and many people had turned their backs on them. Ironically, they were now experiencing the loneliness that Caroline had once tasted. Last week, Caroline bumped into Vivian at the supermarket. Her once glamorous sister stood frozen with a tired expression. Caroline. Vivian stumbled over her words. How are you? Caroline asked gently. I wanted to apologize for that day, tears welled in Vivian's eyes. But I don't know how. Caroline was silent for a while but eventually said quietly, some things need time. But someday, let's talk again. She wasn't ready to forgive Vivian and Martha yet. But she didn't want to continue harboring hatred either. Perhaps someday, they too would understand the true meaning of family. In the evening, Thomas and Richard returned from fishing. Thomas proudly showed off the first fish he had caught himself. In his eyes shone confidence and joy that hadn't been seen before. Mom! Look! I caught it myself. Caroline hugged her son and gave Richard a grateful look. Her heart was filled with warmth. That's wonderful, Thomas. Let's grill this tonight. Richard, you'll join us of course. They gathered around the small dining table, talking about the day's adventures. Caroline smiled quietly, grateful for this new form of family. She understood from her heart that true family is not connected by blood, but by hearts that respect and support one another.